Okay, thank you, Tony, and good afternoon, everybody. As Tony said, we have a short presentation just to take you through the highlights of the September passenger and cargo figures. So if we move to the first slide, you can see cargo remains strong, up 9%. Good cargo performance. We continue to see good demand for air cargo. Sea freight is being impacted by port closures and issues in relation to labour shortages in a number of ports. It's impacting a little bit on air cargo as well, but not to the same degree. So the outlook for air cargo continues to be pretty strong with good demand. Supply is still somewhat constrained, and as we've said before, that's principally because international passenger traffic, which you can see on the chart, is down 69% versus 2019. International passenger traffic continues to be disrupted, and typically about 45 to 50% of air cargo would travel in the belly hold of these long-haul international passenger aircraft. We've seen a rebound in the domestic passenger figures. It's down 24% versus 2019. If we move to the next slide, you can see actually quite a significant range of performance, with Russia up about 29% versus 2019, but Australia down 80%. The US and China, the two big domestic markets, US is about 12% below 2019 and China 26%. But generally, domestic markets are performing well, again, reinforcing our view that once the travel restrictions are removed, we do see strong passenger demand. And now the next slide. Variations in the international travel, which is interesting. You can see the North to Central America is getting back towards 2019 figures, down 8%. Within Europe is down 44%. Europe to North America down 65%. Within Asia is on the floor there. It's effectively flat and down 97% versus 2019. The other two, Europe to Asia and Asia to North America, down around 87 to 90%. So again, quite a variation, but we are seeing some improvements. And again, this reflects the loosening of restrictions in several countries, which we've witnessed in recent weeks. So positive developments in relation to travel restrictions, still slower than we would like to see and slower than we believe the science would support. But good news reports from CEOs around the world suggest that they're now more optimistic about the recovery in business travel. And I think there's some evidence to support that optimism based on figures that individual airlines are seeing in recent months, and indeed some airports reporting similar trends as well. And if we move to the next slide, and this really tells the story of the day. It is principally a situation where the travel restrictions continue to dampen demand, but things heading in the right direction. We've seen some positive announcements in Latin America in recent weeks, Chile opening, Argentina, the same, Bolivia. So there's positive trends here, but still much slower than we would like to see. And the next slide. We've shown this graph before, which demonstrated the strong rebound in bookings once it was announced that the US would open to European travellers. And you can see what happened then again when on the 15th of October, the 8th of November was confirmed as the date on which it will open. So strong demand for travel into and out of the US to Europe. And again, this is a very positive development. It's happening later in the year than we had expected. If you remember, going back earlier this year, we thought that might happen around the start of the third quarter. But it's a positive indication, and certainly I think sends a message to other countries who have had their borders closed that it's now time to start reopening and removing restrictions. And the final slide, I think, positive trends in terms of bookings. But the simple message is, traffic continues to be significantly depressed. And although we are beginning to see a much more positive outlook in terms of travel restrictions, we don't expect to see a sudden rebound. It will take time to recover. But nonetheless, I think the trends are positive. The tone of the industry at the IATA AGM in October was one of cautious optimism. I think that continues since then based on the discussions that we've had with industry leaders. So overall, the September figures, a slight rebound in passenger traffic and good cargo traffic. So continuing the trends that we have been witnessing, strong domestic performance, international travel recovering, and cargo traffic being strong and likely to continue so through the rest of this year and into next year. And just some general comments. We've seen very positive signs from both the ICAO high-level conference on COVID-19 and the G20. The declaration that came from the ICAO conference was positive, very much aligned with the views of IATA. The important thing now is for us to see these nice words translated into action. And we need to see states talking to one another to harmonize their rules. We are seeing some positive developments again in that direction. As you know, we came out to support the use of the EU DCC digital COVID certificate. We now see over 50 countries who have adopted the EU digital certificate and more countries talking to the EU. So I think this certainly helps in terms of getting common standards and a common approach to the reopening of international borders. And with the COP26 in Glasgow, I think the message from the industry has been very loud and very clear. At our AGM, we have committed to achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2050. I think a very significant development by the industry. So we're ready to play our part. We're ready to engage, and in fact have been talking to several governments to reinforce our message that the industry is committed to achieving net zero by 2050. We now need governments to create the right policy framework to assist the industry in achieving that challenging goal, particularly in relation to the development and deployment of wide-scale availability of sustainable aviation fuels. And again, some positive announcements in recent weeks in relation to that. On the other side, less positive with airports and other suppliers, with airport charges continuing to show increases or desire on the part of airports to significantly increase their charges. We saw Schiphol, who had announced their intention to increase charges by 42% over 3 years, adjust their target to 37%. My reaction to that was, wow. So this is completely unacceptable. Now is not the time to be significantly increasing charges. And it was interesting, in fact, at one of the conferences that I attended recently, the ACI, Airport Council International representative for Latin America, made that very statement. He said, now is not the time to be increasing charges. In the interest of recovering lost passenger numbers, I think we have to keep costs under control to facilitate a strong return to international traffic in particular. And my own experience, having done quite a bit of travel in recent weeks with the IATA AGM, the ALTA conference in Bolivia, that's the Association of Latin American carriers and a couple of IATA conferences. We had a cargo conference in Dublin and a digital and retail conference in Madrid. Fantastic response, great turnout from people. People want to get back meeting face-to-face again, greater appreciation for the value of these face-to-face interactions and meetings. And we're seeing the same being repeated by other organisations, all of them seeing positive trends in terms of attendance at in-person events. So we remain cautious about the outlook, but I think it is important to reflect on the positive announcements that have been made in recent weeks, which should facilitate an accelerated improvement in the traffic trends that we are reporting for you today. So on that, I'll pause and hand back to Tony to give you an opportunity to ask some questions.
Great. Thanks very much, Willie. As normal, we'll be taking questions via the chat function. I see we've got a couple of questions in there now, so we'll take them in order. The first question concerns fares. So Willie, what is your expectation based on the demand performance you're seeing? What is your expectation on fares?
So I think the issue that's going to impact on fares in the short to medium term will be the high price of oil, which continues to remain stubbornly high, over $80 Brent, and the likelihood of increased charges from air traffic control providers and airports. So, the industry has no choice but ultimately to reflect these increased costs in ticket prices. I think the supply and demand situation is reasonably balanced. Supply, if anything, is probably a little bit ahead of the demand that we're seeing. So airlines are putting in capacity a little bit faster than the demand is building up. But I would see that supply-demand relationship being pretty much in balance. The big issue will be the pressure on cost base as a result of these external charges, principally fuel, which, as you know, in a typical year represents about 25% of the average airline's cost base. It can be higher for some airlines. And airport and air navigation charges, where we continue to see pressure on prices in those areas. So pricing, as I said, I think will more reflect the costs of operation than the supply and demand scenario.
Okay, thank you, Willie. We have a question about the Dubai Air Show, which is upcoming. And the questioner is asking if we expect airlines to be doing a lot of fleet replacement announcements at that air show.
I'm not aware of any major announcements that are likely to be made, and certainly of the CEOs that I've spoken to, most have sort of taken a cautious approach. But it is clear that airlines have retired quite a lot of aircraft through this pandemic and will need to start rebuilding their fleet as we start rebuilding international travel. So I won't be surprised to see some announcements, but I'm not aware of any significant developments, and certainly neither Boeing nor Airbus have indicated anything at this stage. But there are always some surprises at these air shows, so I'll wait with interest to see what does get announced. But I don't expect anything strange or anything out of the ordinary to be announced.
Okay. We have a question on the charges increases that we're seeing in some airports. And the question specifically asks if IATA will take legal action if we see charges increases that are unacceptable.
Yeah, where we can take action, we certainly will, in consultation with our local members. And I think it is important at a time like this that we use every means available to us to resist the efforts by airports to increase their charges. So in the UK, as you know, the UK CAA is consulting with the industry in relation to their initial announcements. And in fact, I will be having a discussion with the CAA later on today. It's clear that Heathrow is unhappy with what the CAA has indicated. It's also fair to say that airlines are unhappy with the increases that the CAA has suggested that they might be looking at. But Heathrow continues to be determined to see the RAB adjusted to reflect their lost revenues in the 2020 and 2021, which quite frankly is outrageous. The idea that they should have a £2.5 billion sterling adjustment to the RAB because of lost revenue has to be resisted. And although the CAA has very generously, in my opinion, allowed them a £300 million adjustment to the RAB, we have to oppose these developments in any way we can. So, we will use all of the available avenues of protest to resist this. And if legal action is available to us, certainly that is something that we will consider, and we won't hesitate to take it if we believe it's in the interest of our members.
Okay, thanks, Willie. We have another question, sort of sticking with the topic of increased costs. This time it's concerning the recent announcement of the UK APD changes. So how would you rate the announcement, given that in some cases it was a decrease, in other cases an increase? And then what is your perspective on the branding of APD as an environment tax?
So APD, as you know, was introduced many years ago as an environmental tax. I think then successive governments gave up on that charade and admitted it wasn't an environmental tax and was just going to the general exchequer. It was a revenue-raising exercise. So I think it's completely cynical of the UK to try and turn this back into an environmental tax. Simply because of COP26 in Glasgow. So just yet another cynical move on the part of politicians to try and portray themselves as doing the right thing in the interest of the environment. We know that not a single penny of that money that has been raised, billions of pounds over the years, has gone towards improving the environment, and we don't expect a single penny of the money that will be raised to go to environmental issues. On the changes to APD, the issue of the double charge, if you like, on domestic APD has long been something that the industry has highlighted as suppressing demand and adding to the cost of doing business internally within the UK. I find it bizarre that the UK, at a time like this, out there lauding themselves on the basis of reaching these trade agreements with countries around the world, and seeks to increase the cost of doing business with these countries. It's just a contradiction between the ambition of a global trading Great Britain and the steps that they're taking to increase the cost of doing business. So, nothing new in this. We've highlighted these contradictions before, and we will continue to do so. But it clearly will have a negative impact on trade with the UK because it's clearly seen as a tax on doing business. But I suppose the reduction in the domestic APD is a positive development and will be welcomed by consumers in the UK.
Okay. Well, sticking with the topic of environment taxes, one of the questioners asks about the situation in Belgium, where the government is talking about taxing short-haul flights less than 500 or 750 kilometers. Specifically, do you have any comment on that particular issue? And I suppose more broadly, the tendency of governments to look for taxes or to taxes as a solution for the environment. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I think we need to be clear. The data is extremely important here, and Eurocontrol published a study a couple of months ago, which is very interesting. But the basis of that study was to analyze the amount of flying done within Europe on flights of less than 500 kilometers and the environmental impact of those flights. So if you look at all European flying of under 500 kilometers, which is typically the flights that have been targeted by some governments like France and Belgium, it accounts for about 24% of flights. So it's quite a high percentage of flights. But it generates 3.8% of CO2. So, this is not going to achieve a step change in the CO2 performance of the industry. And it's particularly cynical of politicians to talk about making these changes when they could have a 10 to 12% reduction in CO2 if only they move forward with the single European sky. The inefficiency in the ATC system in Europe contributes to about 10 to 12% excess fuel and CO2. And that could be eliminated very quickly without any investment. As I said before, airlines have already invested in the technology on the aircraft to enable them to operate in a more efficient manner. So trying to force people away from flying on these short flights and drive them towards the train, may sound good, but in many cases, train travel isn't available. And certainly, for parts of Europe, Ireland being one, there's a little bit of water in between that the train doesn't tend to, deal with very well. So, it's not going to achieve a step change in environmental performance. I think politicians would be much better off if they were to address the issues that are under their direct control. And the biggest one of those is the situation with the inefficiency in the ATC system in Europe.
Okay, thank you, Willie. Sticking with the topic of environment, we have a questioner who asks what outcomes we're expecting from COP26 that might directly impact the aviation sector.
I think the one that would be most positive and beneficial would be commitments on the part of governments to develop policy frameworks to support the development and production of sustainable aviation fuels. This is the best option available to the industry. It is a credible way of reducing the environmental impact of aviation. Airlines are committed to using sustainable aviation fuels. The problem is that we can't get the supply. It's not a situation of where airlines won't use the fuel. It's that airlines can't use the fuel because it isn't available. And in many cases where airlines are using the fuel to prove that the concept is real, they can't get the 50% blend that is certified at the moment. So as you know, the aircraft that we're operating today, aircraft and engines can operate with a blend of 50% sustainable fuel and 50% jet kerosene. Both Boeing and Airbus are moving to get certification for aircraft and engines at 100% sustainable aviation fuel, and we expect to see that certainly by the end of this decade, if not before. The issue, however, is, with certification at 100%, we can't get 100% sustainable fuel. So we need to see governments incentivize the production of sustainable fuels. We need to see the fuel companies honor the nice verbal commitments they've made to improve their environmental performance by producing significant volumes of sustainable fuels. And we think that will address the problem we have in relation to the cost today, because the cost is principally a function of the low levels of production, inefficiencies in the scale of production that we're seeing today, which clearly will be eliminated if we can significantly ramp up the production of these sustainable fuels. So I think that would be the best outcome. I was somewhat surprised to hear comments from Boris Johnson, who talked about a 10% use of sustainable fuels by 2030 as being pathetic, principally because that's his government's target. So, I think he's calling his own target pathetic. But, that's that is something that we need to address. The industry will accelerate the use of sustainable fuels if the product is available. But in the roadmap that we presented to get to net zero, we were being realistic about the production of the fuel. It's not an issue of use, it's an issue of supply. The demand exists. If the supply can be presented, the industry will use sustainable fuels. We're committing to doing so, and we're excited about the opportunity that it will present.
Thank you very much. On a completely separate topic, we have a question about 5G and some potential safety implications of that implementation for airlines. The questioner says the FAA recently issued a notice that the rollout of 5G in the US could interfere with radar altimeters in aircraft that are vital, obviously, to cockpit safety systems, including TAWS. Does IATA have or share these concerns, or what is IATA doing on this issue?
Yeah, we do share the concerns. Clearly, the radio radar altimeter, the RADALT, is a very important, critical piece of instrumentation on board aircraft today. And anything that interferes with its functionality is something that does cause us concern. We believe that this issue can be addressed by the relevant agencies engaging with one another to ensure that we don't have a situation whereby there is possible interference from 5G antennae to the use of the RADALT. So we are engaged, like a lot of individual airlines, with the aviation authorities around the world to highlight this issue, understand the extent of the problem and the potential impact of the problem, and clearly anything that interferes with the safe operation of an aircraft is something that must be eliminated. So we will be looking to aviation authorities and regulators to address this issue in a sensible manner.
Okay. Changing gears a little bit, we have a question about employment levels in the industry. Given the rate at which the recovery is taking place, what would your expectation for employment levels be? And I suppose a follow-up on that would be, what role do governments have in terms of supporting employment in the industry?
Yeah, I think this is an important issue because we're certainly seeing some indications in certain countries of a problem with the availability of qualified labour in the industry. Clearly, as a result of the severe downturn in traffic going back to March, when it really kicked in, March, April. April we saw traffic down by about 95%. We have seen a lot of people leave the industry, some on a temporary basis, some on a permanent basis. Attracting talent back into the industry will be a challenge. So I think we as an industry have to make sure that we are continuing to look to means to attract good talent into our businesses. And I think governments clearly can assist in providing support in this area, particularly when it comes to issues like training. There are still a lot of areas where assistance could be provided to the industry to ensure that we can get more people trained and qualified to enter the industry. But I think this is potentially going to be one of the bottlenecks that we experience as we see traffic ramp up. And certainly we've seen reports of this impacting on airlines' ability to operate in the US domestic market, where the recovery, as we've said before, has been quite strong. So it's an important issue. I've spent 43 years in this industry. I've never seen a situation where there's been a shortage of labour. We've often talked about it potentially happening, but I think this is probably the period when we could actually see a real shortage of labour that will impact on the industry's ability to re-establish networks as quickly as they might like to.
Okay. And moving back into COVID-19 topics more specifically, we have a question from India asking about the Indian government's, I suppose, focus on bubble arrangements as a way of reopening international air services. The questioner specifically asked for any comments on the situation in India, but then beyond that, are you concerned about the disparity in the way that various governments are approaching the reopening? Does that give you any concerns?
It does give us concerns about the disparity, because clearly it would be much easier for people if there was a more common approach being adopted by governments and greater recognition and mutual recognition of measures that have been introduced. India is a specific case because these so-called bubbles, I don't really think are driven by COVID. Because we've heard of the desire on the part of the Indian government to renegotiate their air service agreements. So I don't think it's directly a COVID issue. I think COVID is being used to mask a different issue. Now, clearly, governments have the right to renegotiate air service agreements, but we would expect that to be done in a proper fashion, and that governments don't use the situation of a global pandemic to try and unilaterally establish new air service agreements. But clearly we would prefer to see greater coordination between governments, accelerated mutual recognition of measures, and it's principally to facilitate consumers who are very confused by the different requirements. I can speak from personal experience. My recent trip took me from Geneva through London to Miami, then New York, then Bogota, Madrid, and back to Geneva. Understanding the different travel requirements, the different forms that needed to be filled in, the testing regimes, when I had to do them, how, valid the validity times for various measures, very, very confusing. And I'm speaking as somebody who's very familiar with this and is, a regular flyer. I think for people who are flying once or twice a year, it is causing great confusion. And I think governments owe it to their people to have measures that are sensible, clearly understandable, but where possible to align them. The challenge is the same everywhere. The solution should be similar, if not the same, everywhere. And the closer we get to, harmonizing the requirements, I think the better for everybody, and clearly would certainly help in the recovery of the industry.
Okay. We have a question from Europe, and the questioner says that ACI Europe has sent a complaint to Brussels in conjunction with the French airports opposing the French policy to disallow flights under 2.5 hours, where train service is available in less than 2.5 hours. The questioner asks, first, do we support that position? And secondly, would we consider doing our own or joining that legal complaint?
No, we've not given any consideration to joining that legal complaint. As I pointed out, these measures may sound good, possibly well motivated by politicians who don't understand the issue. But, as we pointed out, if you were to eliminate all flights in Europe of less than 500 kilometers, the reduction in CO2 coming from that would be 3.8%. That's not going to make the change that we need to see in the industry, and particularly when the industry has committed to achieving net zero in 2050. There are other measures that can be taken, would be much more sensible, would create a better environmental result, and that's without getting into the debate around the environmental impact of train travel. So while it may have a lower CO2 footprint, depending, of course, on where the electricity to power the train is generated from. France might be unique in terms of its renewable energies and nuclear energy, but that wouldn't be the same for a lot of other European countries. And then you've got issues in relation to land use, noise, which is a much bigger problem for rail than it is for road, rail than it is for air, despite the fact that people often highlight noise as being an issue impacting on the growth of air travel. It's much greater when it comes to noise from rail and the number of people who are directly impacted by noise. So I think this is a debate that should be based on facts and science rather than on the perception of it. But to answer the simple question, no, we haven't considered joining a legal challenge.
Okay. Looking ahead, we're approaching the winter season, which is normally a difficult period, or at least a slow period for the industry. What do you expect for this winter season? And specifically, I suppose, do you expect to see bankruptcies, failures, etc.? Or do you think the industry is on the right trajectory to get through it?
No, I think,
in good shape?
Yeah, I think we're on the right trajectory. We're seeing a slow rebuild. Domestic travel, as we've said, has effectively recovered where restrictions are removed. International travel is going in the right direction. So I don't see anything outside of the restrictions that governments continue to have in place being of concern to the industry. I suspect this will just be a normal winter for the industry to deal with, as we've dealt with for many winter seasons before.
Okay. And earlier, Willie, you referenced the reopening of the US to countries that were previously banned from entry. The questioner says, given the fact that there's a fair amount of paperwork, or at least checking involved in getting there, proving vaccination status and proving you having taken a test before travel, are you convinced that the airlines are fully prepared to deal with the additional processing? And do you have any concerns about long lines, congestion, etc.?
Yeah, it's a great question. We clearly were concerned by the impact that these measures would have on the functioning of airports, and hence the reason we focused on the development of the IATA travel pass. I think with the increase in passenger traffic, we're seeing more airlines turn to us now to adopt the IATA travel pass or other measures to enable their customers to continue to access online check-in. So we're reasonably happy that the measures that we've taken will facilitate higher volumes of passenger traffic on the transatlantic. We anticipated the need for these checks. It's not unusual. Many countries are requiring validation of vaccine status and test status. So we've been dealing with this for some time. It adds complexity. It certainly adds to the bureaucracy for the individual who's traveling. But, we will deal with it. We prefer not to have to deal with it. But I think we've got the right measures in place to be able to cope with the requirement that will be placed on airlines. The good news is that the market is reopening. We've been calling for this for some considerable time, and we've got to see this as a positive development. And I think that's reflected in the chart that I showed you, where we've seen a significant increase in bookings between the US and Europe and vice versa as a result of the announcements. And I think there are a lot of people looking forward to being able to travel to the United States from the 8th of November and connect with family and friends that they've been unable to do so since March of 2020. So, as I said, let's take this as a positive. We'll deal with the additional workload, and we're comfortable that we have the right measures in place to be able to facilitate the increase in traffic that will result from this change on the 8th of November.
Willie, previously you'd suggested that the COVID-19 measures should be in place during the COVID period, but not longer than that. Are you confident that that's the way things are unfolding, or could we face testing, vaccination proof, etc., for a long period of time?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's some positive signs. We are seeing some governments reducing the requirement for testing as a result of the high levels of vaccination. So I think the indications point to the requirements being reduced. Our issue has really centered on as soon as the requirements are no longer required, they should be removed rather than reduced. And that's something that we clearly will be continuing to highlight with governments. You know, there isn't any need for a lot of these measures in many parts of the world. It just requires politicians to be a little bit braver and take this step to remove these requirements, which may have been sensible 18 months ago. I'm not arguing that we shouldn't have had some restrictions, but I think for the restrictions to continue to be in place and the requirements to continue to be the same as governments introduced 18 months ago, I think that's something that we can and will challenge. But we have seen a number of governments respond positively and to remove either the requirement for testing where there's evidence of vaccination, and that's a positive sign.
Okay. We have a question about oil prices, and the question is but a few parts to it. What do we expect the impact will be to the industry? How long do we expect oil prices to be at these elevated levels? And could it potentially stall the recovery?
Well, if I knew what was going to happen to the oil price, I certainly wouldn't be sitting here talking to you guys. The reality is nobody knows. I've always considered that a high oil price like we're seeing today is probably a positive indication for the industry because it typically reflects a strong economic demand. As once you take out speculation, which I don't think there's much of that involved. We have seen that in the past, but I think that the principal reason the oil price is high at the moment is because economic conditions are positive and growing, and that clearly is something that helps the industry. Ultimately, given that oil impacts on every airline, these higher oil prices will be reflected in ticket prices, as I've said before. And in a situation where airlines have made huge losses in recent months and years, it's impossible for airlines to absorb these increases. So they will have to be passed on to consumers, and that will have an impact on pricing. I don't think it will stall the recovery. As I said, the situation today is most airlines are either not hedged or have a very low level of hedging. So the impact is pretty much the same on every airline. And that means that I don't expect to see any distortion in competition. So I'm not aware of any airlines that have high levels of hedging in place to protect themselves against the increase in oil prices that we're seeing at the moment. So I don't think it will stall recovery. It may make some management teams a little bit more cautious about adding back in capacity. But ultimately, I think the capacity will come back in to reflect the increasing demand as restrictions on travel get removed. So at this stage, I don't see it having a negative impact on recovery, but I do see it having an impact on pricing, which ultimately may lead to some lower demand in the long term, but not going to suppress the demand recovery in the short and medium term.
Okay. We have a question about Europe and specifically the low-cost sector. The questioner asked, do you believe that European low-cost airlines will emerge much stronger from the crisis? And could we see a comeback of long-haul low-cost airlines on the North Atlantic?
So I think all airlines have been impacted by this pandemic. All balance sheets have been stressed. I was looking at the UK latest data on the CCFF, whatever was the coronavirus financing that the UK government put in place. And Wizz accessed 300 million, Ryanair accessed 600 million, EasyJet, I think 300 million, BA 300 million, Jet2, I think was close to 300 million. So all of these airlines applied for financial assistance. Now it's commercial paper; it has to be repaid. But I think that demonstrates that this crisis has impacted on everybody. It's not just a case of it impacting on some airlines; it's impacted on them all. The low-cost airlines may recover faster because typically they're more focused on leisure and VFR traffic, which is recovering ahead of business travel. Now they all clearly have a business travel element to their flying as well. But I think the leisure market has clearly recovered faster than the business market. Now I expect business to recover. As I said, I'm more optimistic about the recovery in business travel than I had been. So they will probably have a slight advantage in the pace of recovery. But the bottom line is, the airlines with strong balance sheets going into this will be the airlines that will be strong coming out of it. And it's not really a factor of the business model. It's the fact that, Ryanair and Wizz in particular were very good, efficient airlines before this crisis and will continue to be coming out. I don't see it having a fundamental change in the way the industry operates. Long-haul, low-cost is a really challenging segment. To do it properly, you have to have a very clear focus on the market you're operating in and on your cost base. And the cost advantages that you have on long haul are not the same as airlines had on short haul, because principally, one of the key areas was on asset utilization. You're not able to get any greater asset utilization on long haul, regardless of your business model. Whereas clearly that was an area where the low cost airlines significantly improved versus the traditional legacy hub operators. So I don't see the pandemic changing the dynamics of the market in that way. I'm sure there will be people who will try and launch long haul, low cost, and will claim to have the secret to success. But I know from experience that it's a very challenging segment, and to do it successfully is going to require great skill.
We have a question from Africa. The questioner says that many of the reopenings that we're seeing are based on travelers being vaccinated. Across Africa, vaccination rates are still very low. What does that mean for the continent in terms of its connection to the rest of the world? And are you concerned that the alternative pathways to travel, other than vaccination, are really very, very narrow?
Yeah, it is a concern. Obviously, we've always felt that vaccination was the key to unlocking a lot of the restrictions, but we've been equally vocal that vaccination shouldn't be the only way to enable people to travel. It's very important, given that there hasn't been equal access to vaccines, that people should continue to be able to fly if they're not vaccinated, subject to a sensible testing regime. Now, I think this brings into question the use of PCR versus lateral flow testing. All of the evidence that I've seen, and this has been particularly strong in recent months, suggests that lateral flow testing is as effective, indeed maybe even more effective as a risk mitigant, when it comes to travel. And therefore, I think having the availability of sensible testing regimes for people who aren't vaccinated is very, very important. We are seeing traffic in Africa recover at a slightly slower pace than globally. I would hope that the changes that we have seen, where some countries are now accepting lateral flow in place of more expensive and less available PCR testing, will help that. But it is absolutely critical. We have to have a world where people, regardless of the vaccination status, can travel, principally because, there are a lot of countries around the world that just can't access the vaccines. So if you can't access the vaccine, I think arrangements for a testing regime should be in place. And so long as that testing regime is simple and affordable, it should not deter the recovery in traffic to and from Africa.
Okay. We have a question about debt levels. During the crisis, airlines accumulated debt. When banks and governments asked for their money back, what impact do you think that will have on the industry?
Debt level clearly has significantly increased. Earlier this year, we said it had gone up by about $200 billion to $650 billion. It will require some time for airlines to repay that, but you've seen that most airlines have a stated desire to repay that as quickly as possible to get their balance sheet back into proper shape. Some of that is, it's because they want to ensure that they have headroom in their balance sheet if another event comes along. But more importantly, I think it's it's the desire to ensure that we don't see untoward political interference in the commercial operations of airlines. So it will lead to a more cautious industry. I think focus on repairing balance sheet will be the primary focus of many, if not most, airlines. And I expect the industry to work hard to repay the debt as quickly as it can.
Thank you. We have a question from Europe, which is asking about low-cost airlines, particularly Ryanair and Wizz Air, which have been, the questioner says that they've been asking airports for discounts in order to fly there and in order to base aircraft there. The questioner says, do we agree with this practice, or do we think it's market distortion? And do we think that the European Commission should take a stand on this?
No, I don't see why the European Commission should. I think airports claim to be commercially motivated. If they are engaging with airlines on a commercial basis, should be okay for them. So, I don't think there's anything new in this. I don't think it's something that only Ryanair and Wizz do. I think every airline tries to engage with airports to negotiate arrangements and to look for incentives to either add traffic or to grow traffic, where they possibly can. So I don't see that this in any way distorts the market, and I don't believe it's a practice that is new coming out of this pandemic.
Okay. We have a question about IATA Travel Pass. The questioner says they understand that the testing is completed, but they don't see the product in the market. When will travelers be able to see IATA Travel Pass live?
Yeah, the reason the product is not widely available is because international travel is still down nearly 70% versus 2019. So as we've said, the reason we developed this was to enable airlines to offer online service to their customers as the traffic started building up again. And that's what we're seeing now. So, more and more airlines are looking to, introduce the IATA Travel Pass into their day-to-day operation, because they can see the buildup of traffic is going to require them to have a digital solution. They can cope with a manual solution at the moment because traffic levels are reasonably low. But as these levels increase, then the need for a digital solution will become essential. So more and more airlines are actually now using it. In fact, we're coming under pressure from airlines to accelerate the rollout, where we're dealing with some airlines. So, there's one airline who had planned to have it in place for December, wrote to me the other day saying they want it by the middle of November now, instead of the end of December. So they can see the value of this, but it's principally to deal with passenger volumes as the volumes increase, and with international travel still, only at 30% of where we were in 2019. Manual processes are an option available to airlines, but that's not going to be possible once we get higher volumes of passengers traveling internationally.
Okay, thank you, Willie. We have a couple of minutes left and a few questions in the queue, so we'll try and get to them quickly. We have one question which asks about how we're engaging travel agents in the recovery, and particularly, are airlines relying enough on travel agents to help explain to the travelers the complexity of traveling at this period in time?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure airlines need to depend on travel agents, but it is clearly one of the advantages of dealing with a travel agent, where they can explain in person to the traveller the requirements involved. So long as the travel agent is properly and fully briefed on all of the requirements. Again, I think everybody has a role to play in encouraging people to get back flying again. And I think travel agents have played that role in the past, and I'm sure will play that role going forward. There are a lot of parts of the world where dealing with a travel agent is, the only way or the principal way of doing business with an airline, and I think that will continue to be the case for some time. So I think the industry is working well together. I think the relationship between agents and airlines is probably stronger today than it's been for many years, and I would expect that to continue, given that there's a common objective of getting more people back in the air as quickly as possible.
Okay. And then we have a question, I believe from Latin America, and they're referencing airlines that have announced their exit from Chapter 11. And the questioner asks, does this mean that we shouldn't expect consolidation, I suppose, in the Latin American market, but also broadly around the world?
Yeah, I commented on this before, because I think given the state of balance sheets at the moment, I think consolidation is less likely to happen. So if you've got a reasonably strong balance sheet, you're not going to be very quick to try and consolidate with an airline with a weak balance sheet, because it's just going to make you weaker. It doesn't necessarily make you better in the long term. It clearly would, but in the short term, I think it just increases the risk. So I think airlines are going to be more cautious around consolidation. Consolidation will happen, but I think there's just going to be a lot more caution in the industry because of the damage that has been done to balance sheets. And, when it comes to acquisitions, I can't see many airlines being ready to spend the precious cash that they have on hand to acquire an underperforming airline at a time like this. I'm not sure we'll see a lot of consolidation in the short to medium term, but I think we will ultimately get back to a situation where consolidation will happen, and consolidation will benefit the industry.
And then the last question references the reopening of the U.S. market in a few days' time. The questioner wants to know how important that U.S. to Europe market is for the industry, and secondly, how important a symbol or example will that set for other countries to follow in reopening?
I think it's very important, both for the industry and in terms of the message that it sends. I think the fact that the US was closed to Europe gave a lot of other countries comfort that they could keep their borders closed. I think with the US reopening for travel from Europe, it does highlight the border restrictions that are in place in other parts of the world. And I don't think it's a coincidence that many other countries started to announce the reopening of their borders on the back of what was announced by President Biden. And in terms of importance to the industry, very important, the biggest international market there is. It's traditionally been a very strong area for revenue and profitability for the industry. And it clearly is a very positive development for airlines that have significant exposure traditionally to the transatlantic market. So I think important on all measures, and great to see it happening.
Okay. Willie, could I prevail on you for one last question?
Yep.
Okay. It's a slightly different topic than we've addressed earlier, but it references the net zero issue, and it asks basically what the position of the Chinese carriers is on that. And are you concerned about the seeming disagreement that might have appeared at the AGM?
No, I'm not in any way concerned. In fact, I think it highlights how difficult a decision this has been for many airlines around the world. As we've said, the Chinese airlines have made it clear their absolute commitment to achieving net zero. Their challenge was the time frame that we were looking at net zero by 2050, when China is committing to net zero by 2060. So they felt that it would be difficult for them to align with 2050, given the position of the Chinese government and the objective of reaching net zero in 2060. So I don't see any contradiction. They're totally committed to net zero. As I said, I think it highlighted the difficulty in getting the industry to the position we did. But the situation is clear now. The IATA commitment on behalf of the industry is to achieve net zero in 2050, and I'm very confident that that's what the industry will do.
Super. Thanks very much, Willie. With that, we're just about 5 minutes past the hour. So I'll thank everybody for their participation today.